I'm Bill Harris, Managing Director of the New York office of Perkins & Will and Regional Practice Leader for Science and Technology for Perkins & Will. I'm actually the new Managing Director. I've been in New York for 3 months, just 3 months. I'm a transplant from Boston. So you're looking at a panel of Bostonians here with each of us having a bit of a foothold in the city. My own background is that I have been working in the life science industry for about 30 years, initially and predominantly focused on the life science company, the tenant that all of us are seeking, right? The job creators. But that has expanded to include working with developers who are building spaces for these tenants, and also working with cities like the city entities like the EDC and others around the country and the world, in fact, who are all looking up to the Northeast at Boston and wanting a little bit of the secret sauce and a little bit of the success that has come out of that environment. So we have a terrific panel today, and the topic being, what can New York City learn from the competition? It seems like Boston's been the subject already this morning for most of the conversation. But we have very interesting perspectives from veterans. All of us have worked together actually for many years and are well experienced with the marketplace. And I'd like to begin actually with Kent Knight from Elkus Manfredi, who's sitting at the far end here, who's going to introduce himself a little bit and also give people a sort of visual perspective to complement what you've already heard from the previous panel about the Boston market.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning. I'm Kent Knight with Elkus Manfredi Architects, a vice president with the firm. We've done quite a bit of life science work in the Boston-Cambridge market, and also had the pleasure of working with Nancy on the New York Genome Center, and Bill Harvey, Mitch, and other folks here in the presentation, and that was quite an experience. I'm going to take you back to 1981. This is what Kendall Square used to be. On the right, of course, is MIT, is still there. Just at the bottom of the slide, you see just the tip of Draper Lab, which was built in the mid-'70s. But otherwise, this is a sea of parking lots. This site was cleared by the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority. The only buildings at the time, commercial buildings, were 1 Broadway, which is an office building, the Volpe National Transportation Center, which ended up in Cambridge because Johnson became president and NASA ended up in Houston. And the first building that Boston Properties did, 5 Cambridge Center, this of course became the full Cambridge Center development. But that building was done for the Stride Rite Children's Shoe Company. Going to today, it's a very different picture. One of the interesting lessons I think about Kendall Square is that because of MIT, but also MGH across the river and Harvard, the space, the development of Kendall Square grew up with biotechnology as it grew up as a new scientific field. They ran parallel, and they still do. We talked earlier about transportation. The red line bisects this slide right down the middle, right down Main Street. There's a stop at MIT, Kendall Square. It's right in the heart of Kendall Square at one of MIT's front doors. 1 stop to the top of the slide, you're at MGH. 2 stops to the bottom, you're at Harvard University. 9 out of the 10 largest pharma companies are located in this area. Not only Novartis, but firms like Pfizer, Biogen, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Johnson & Johnson, Shire, to name a few of those. You also have, because of the academic influence, major research institutions such as the Whitcower Brain and Cog Center and also the Koch Cancer Center, both part of MIT. Right across the street is the Whitehead Institute, where the human genome was first sequenced. And right next door to that, Eric Lander then moved to the Broad, and we did the first building for the Broad. Not 5 years later, they more than doubled their size and are in their second building now. Now what you're seeing in the evolution of the square is these biotechs and the research institutes are being joined by big data. So Google, Amazon, Facebook, they all want a presence. They all want to be within a view of the dome of MIT. The precinct, as we call it, is comprised of about 580 acres, all the way from the Cambridge Site Galleria on the east side of the MIT, and really wrapping all the way around behind MIT. This is truly the halo effect of MIT being built out, but all the way west towards the old Ford assembly plant, which Matimco converted, of course, to life science. So what are the facts? There's about 18.7 million square feet of commercial space here as compared to that 1.7 we heard about in New York. It's about a 40% office to 60% lab split. MIT has an additional 13 million square feet. There's about 1 million under construction currently, with an additional capacity estimated at 5.8 to 6 million. You also have, which we've touched on this morning, but a true mixed-use neighborhood. You have residential, you have hotels, you have those bars and restaurants and nightlife that the users, the scientists, are really looking for. And just a few slides of the character of Kendall Square. Just in terms of lessons learned, this all really started with University Park, right behind MIT, that Forest City developed starting in the mid-'80s. The first building that was built there was targeted for an engineering firms. The first tenant, this is at 38 Sydney Street, was a biotech tenant. They used, I think they took one floor of the 5-story building, something like that. They used all of the capacity of the services in the building, all the air, all the electrical. And so the first lesson was these biotech guys are looking for a lot more than we're used to giving them. And of course, we've learned a lot since the mid-'80s. We've talked about the adjacency to the great institutions, Harvard, MIT, Mass General Hospital, and that equates to your 9 academic medical research centers here. And I think one of the most important things is, and you touched on this in the question, you don't want to attract just the Fortune 500 companies. You need those middle guys, you need the startups, you need the innovation companies, you need the lab centrals that are going to be incubators and graduate companies as they grow. And also in Kendall Square, you find venture capital firms, investment firms, side by side with the research and the academics, all rubbing shoulders at lunch and dinner. It's that face-to-face connectivity that's so important to this cluster. Thank you.
Thanks, Kent. Our next speaker is Bill Kane with Biomed Realty, and he's going to give a slightly different perspective on his history with Kendall Square and the developments there.
Thanks, Bill. I'd like to introduce myself more accurately as probably the most lucky person on the face of this planet, and I'll explain that in a second. I work for Biomed Realty. We're a full-service life science real estate operator. We're based in San Diego, which is a great place to go for a corporate meeting, especially in February. A good portion of the office surfs in the morning. We have meetings out there. It's a great place to be. And we also have the good fortune of being Blackstone entity, or owned and operated by Blackstone Real Estate, one of the largest, or the largest real estate provider in the world, which naturally gives us an extraordinary amount of strength in what we do and support. As you see on the map, our territories are distributed among 6 core markets, all of them in the domestic U.S. with the exception of Cambridge, UK. We're actually hosting a panel event next month, Cambridge versus Cambridge. We're hosting it in Cambridge, and it's going to be a bit of a duel between the 2 teams, which is going to be fun to do. Colleen O'Connor is the speaker on that. She's here. I'm embarrassing her now just to prepare for the event. The portfolio we have, which makes it incredibly exciting to work on, has over 200 life science tenants calling us, interacting with us, building with us, complaining, celebrating, doing all the things that they do, which makes it really, really interesting. And as Ken pointed out, the diversity is really important. So there's a little pie chart that's hard to read, but it kind of just, as you can see the colors, it more or less describes the diversity that we maintain within our portfolio. It's important to maintain that ebb and flow of small companies ebbing into big companies and vice versa. Sometimes they split off, and very, very often a lot of their employees and leaders turn to starting companies. Moving on to our platform, I think this is one of the most important parts of my job, the most dynamic aspect of operating a portfolio across a bunch of core markets, almost 11 million square feet in total. It's really the platform and the people that we have, incredibly passionate group of people who love what they do. They're interacting with PhDs every day. They're interacting with people trying to cure cancer. It's a very technical business. We have facilities teams. We've got property managers. We have legal. We have development. And they all collaborate and develop best practices across the board. They debate. We have conflicts. We have issues amongst ourselves. We duke it out and find out where our priorities are and how we can hone the business better every day. And it amounts to about 150 people across the portfolio and about 35 in Cambridge, which is where I am. The best part of it, which makes me lucky, is since I run leasing for the East Coast, which includes New York and Cambridge and the UK, every good thing we do is more or less credited to me. So I deserve all the credit, and you can thank me after the panel for all of our success. The last thing I'd like to say is that there are a couple points that I picked up in the previous panelists, and perhaps we can talk about a little more, but I think the word competition is something we should think about or reconsider. Steve Perper brought up a good point that Boston needs New York, and he's absolutely right. If you look at the foundation of MIT science and commercialization, they encourage their professors and science leaders to go out and commercialize and start new businesses with very few strings attached or pulling them back to spend more time in the campus. They said, go out and go do it. And that kind of mantra has followed through in Kendall. And gone are the days where you're building these silos where people are hiding, and preserving their ideas. We've gone really from mechanical and physical engineers to social engineers in the way we design our spaces, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But the nature of the business is collaboration. The nature of the business is joining forces to get from A to B faster and more efficiently. And Nancy, I was joking, I told her she did all the hard work for us, explaining what has changed in the industry and how it's moving faster and what technology has encouraged that. So I think that's an important thing for us to consider and talk about.
Great, thank you. And our third panelist is Rob Albro with King Street Properties. And Rob, would you like to introduce yourself and your perspective on the topic?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having us down here. So again, Rob Albro, King Street Properties. We are a local developer up in Boston. We were founded in 2002. We exclusively focus on life science. We're one of the few that does so in Boston. Our portfolio is about 1.5 million square feet. We have 1 million square feet under development. We're a little bit different than a lot of folks. We've been talking a lot about Kendall Square. We've actually focused outside of Kendall Square. We own space in, for those of you that are familiar with the Boston area, Alewife, Lexington, Waltham. We're doing some development in Boston as well. So we have a little bit of a different perspective. The other thing that we've done a little bit differently is that we've done a lot of speculative development in Boston. You see a lot of it now, but historically there hasn't been a lot. A lot of it has been anchored by tenants. And we kind of pioneered doing speculative development in Boston, especially outside of Kendall Square. And I think that's relevant to New York because we think that that's one of the key aspects here. Although everybody wants to find an anchor tenant, we think that doing a spec development is something that will be very successful down here, and I'm sure we'll go into it later. Along that point, the other thing a lot of people don't realize in Boston is where a lot of the growth has been. Obviously, Kendall Square has been incredibly successful, growing leaps and bounds. You know, we've kind of gone through that. But there's also been tremendous growth outside of Kendall Square in the Seaport we touched upon, Longwood, Boston Landing, and then Waltham, Lexington, and up through Bedford. And I think this, again, this is relevant to New York when we talk about the clustering aspect. Although everybody wants to plant Kendall Square here in New York, our view is that it's going to be what we call unanchored for some period of time. There's going to be pockets, and we've kind of talked about it, pockets around the city, and ultimately there probably will be clusters, but there's going to be locations throughout the city for quite some time, largely due to the economics and also the idea of replicating. You know, you might be able to do one or two buildings, but the idea of replicating it in the immediate vicinity is a lot less likely in New York, given, you know, competing uses. So I think we have a little bit of a different view than some others. But it's all, you know, when we look at New York versus Boston, you know, we're down here because we think there's great opportunity, and obviously we've heard that so far today.
That's great. Your comment about the speculative development is apropos of previous questions and so forth. What gives you your confidence in taking that approach, and what makes you nervous about it?
Everything makes us nervous. You know, obviously Boston's a different market given the demand and supply characteristics. But I think in New York, you know, we've spent a lot of time looking at the NIH funding and the number of postdocs and things we've talked about here. And we're really scratching our head when we started, you know, looking at the life science community and trying to figure out, you know, what are we missing? There's got to be something missing. Why hasn't this taken off? And we spent probably 6 or 9 months kind of looking through that. And obviously the city's initiatives, the state's initiatives, the fact that we're all here today, you know, obviously things are moving in the right direction. You know, I think where we are with the incubators, the VCs, you know, we're seeing a lot more activity. We're hearing a lot more tenants. We have tenants reaching out to us in Boston, hearing that we're looking down here, hearing that we're, you know, actively pursuing something, saying, you know, what's going on. These are some scientists reaching out directly to us. So you're hearing more about it in Boston as well. People are curious about New York. You know, from the risk standpoint, you know, there's always that, and Steve talked about it. We talk about this all the time. We talk to capital partners and other folks, and we kind of go through the story, and they say, that's great. Just send us the tenants in the market list and the lease comps, and, you know, we'll be all set. And we say, well, therein lies, you know, the opportunity and the risk is that it really doesn't exist. And if it did, this would be a totally different conversation. So, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, you've got to stick your neck out. I think that next, you know, these next few projects are going to be perceived to be out there on the risk spectrum. But we feel like there's a lot of demand that's going to come pretty quickly.
So, Bill, talk a little bit about what Rob brought out, which is the financial markets that support these developments and the difference of the asset class between office, typical office, and what we're talking about here with life science labs.
Sure. Steve described 20 plus years ago a time when the market was 30% vacant. There weren't many people developing in the field. I was in Kendall at the time working on getting a large mixed-use 10-acre development started. It was really hard to find capital partners. It was really hard to find lenders. And when you did, it was really hard to have conversations not just up front, but through the whole spectrum of the project process. Since then, the whole asset class has become much more sophisticated on all fronts. First of all, on the tenant front, there's been a lot more capital injected into the industry. not just from venture capital or NIH. There's philanthropic, there's big pharma, there's a speed of technology that has allowed tenants to become a lot more focused and targeted and precise about what they're doing and increase the likelihood that they're going to realize a data point or a success point or a milestone quicker and faster. There's been a diversification. And naturally, our most important aspect of our investment model is the proximity and the consolidation of science and technology and people. And it's collapsed into Kendall Square to a point where today we have 230 companies, 63,000 employees, literally working in Kendall Square in bio and tech. And we have 163 bio and tech companies per square mile. It's the deepest cluster in the world. That alone yields a lot of investment credit to investing in a building that is very specific to an industry that is thriving in a specific place. So we came up with a model, among others, of investing in the industry as opposed to one tenant. We program the space in a way that adapts very, very easily and very cheaply. Most recently, we've been analyzing the rolls of our leases and find that they roll lighter and more efficiently than a lot of office leases do, for reasons we can talk about. We find that tenants are backfilling at a much faster rate, and it's tightened up our model in a great way. Sal Zino, who's also here, is the other person I'm embarrassing. He's come up with a notion called precision programming, where he investigates the makeup of the market and the types of tenants and what they're doing, and applies that to the programmatic definition of the building. So if it's programmatically accurate, it's flexible and adaptable, and it's relatively light and cheap to roll, and it's in a cluster that is very robust, deep institutional support and good fundamentals. That is a significant development from an investor's standpoint. And it's actually made it a very interesting model for us to replicate. Blackstone, I would say, has been the ultimate testament to us getting the asset class approved and accepted. So that was really the eye-opener for us, the most recent one, when they purchased our entire portfolio 2.5 years ago.
So you would expect that the capital markets would be now primed and ready in New York and not have to go through those sort of trials that we went through in Cambridge years ago.
Only if they hired you, Bill.
Or Kent, you know,
Right. I'm just
can
teasing.
work together.
There's, but on that notion, there is a very deep pool of talent across the board among you and Kent, among structural engineers, among mechanical engineers, that understand how to design this very specific asset class in a way that doesn't just achieve the HVAC stuff that we heard about earlier, but also applies to the very specific market and how that market behaves. You know, is it a vaccine diagnostics market, or is it a biology market, or is it an institutional market? Those are very, very different programmatic outputs when you design a building. And just to recall what I was talking about earlier, we feel very, very strongly about the performance of a platform. You know, if I'm out there and I'm engaging with a tenant, whether it's up front or in the middle of their lease, I've got a whole team of supporters who educate me on the financing, the legal, the mechanical, the property management. We create this kind of best practice of services and offerings for our tenants, just to minimize the risks that we face. So I'm not making mistakes as we put it in ink on paper in a lease. We make a decision on a development. That, of course, is among the most important of my function, is to lean on that support, whether it be outside our firm or inside our platform.
Thank you. So Kent, from your perspective, it seems like a lot of what Rob and Bill have been saying reinforces your story about the beginnings at University Park, that what is now a hub of life science was not built for life science. And what was an independent element is now surrounded by a complex ecosystem. What are the core lessons that you would bring to New York from that experience?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. When Forest City undertook that project, I was with Coder Kim at the time. This was the mid-'80s, and we did do a comprehensive master plan that was we worked carefully with the city of Cambridge, with the planning department, and laid out the parcels, the open space. I think there was a notion of it being mixed use. There was an idea that all the ground floors would eventually become retail, which really hasn't happened. It's started to seep in off Mass Ave, but it hasn't come all the way back in yet. But it's true. What happened is that 38 Sydney, the first building they did, they missed the market because nobody knew that biotech was this freight train coming at us and it wasn't going to stop. But so we had to be flexible. We quickly adapted 64 Sydney Street, which was built right next door. We learned those lessons and upped all the capacities, and it was life science from then on. There's a hotel there. There's a grocery store, for those of you not familiar with it. Housing, there's some live space there, different types of housing, some loft spaces, some apartment buildings, but mostly, let's see, Millennium Pharmaceuticals moved in there. Akamai, I think, was in there. So.
And I think there's another lesson to extrapolate from what we heard from Nancy earlier. We think we know it all now, right? Especially those of us with roots in Boston. We know how to build life science space. But the life science space for the next generation is not going to be what we look at now. And so when we design and build, and you folks fund and capitalize space to accommodate this market, we can only guess that in 5 or 10 years, it's the occupancies are going to be quite different to reflect all the changes that Nancy was talking about.
If I could add to that and back to the speculative aspect versus design to suit or build to suit. With our clients, whether it's Alexandria or MIT investment company, typically we take a project through permitting. These are large buildings that usually run in the range of 500,000 square feet, sometimes a little smaller, but 8, 9-story buildings, multi-tenant buildings. The permitting process in Cambridge is time-consuming and involved, so we like to get the project permitted, and then it will usually go on the shelf until there's a major tenant, and that will kick off the project. And Bill, to your point, usually the first things that happen is that tenant is looking for a vivarium. They want their own elevator, they want their own dock. They're looking for a second service elevator that you never had planned for. They have emergency generators they've got to get in. They've got to get different chemical tanks, whether it's liquid nitrogen or whatever. You're expanding your dock, you're redesigning the building sort of on the fly, and that happens with every tenant, I would say. And it's just the nature of the beast. So you got to be flexible, you got to be facile, and this applies to the whole team, the developer right on down through the architect and the consultants.
Excellent. And just to wrap up, I'm going to throw you a bit of a softball here, but a lot of what you were talking about, Bill, in your introduction, is your role as a developer in engaging with your tenants in helping them formulate their programs and develop space suited for them. And Rob, you alluded to this as well. And the softball is the importance and value of having experience with this tenant class as a developer. And what your sense is in just the last brief comments from each of you.
You first.
It is a softball. I mean, so my background, I came from the office world originally, and it was a stark contrast coming to life science. One minor example, especially earlier stage companies, they're scientists, all the folks there, they want to advance their science. They're not as focused on the real estate. So we really kind of hold their hands through the process, whether it's planning the space. Part of it's self-serving because we want to make sure that it's reusable and functions correctly. but it's also really helping people grow, and we've had great success, and I know Bill could say the same thing. We have a tenant that started at 3,000 square feet. We just built a building, and they went into 100,000 square feet, and we've grown with them. And there's a lot of value to having that relationship throughout the whole life cycle, and there's many, many examples in Boston of that. So it really is a hands-on, even if we're giving a TI allowance, we go to every single job meeting. We're very, very much involved in the operations, all throughout the, up and down the chain within the company. I think it's a big difference from operating an office building.
Great. Bill, last words?
I would just say, just to avoid repeating what Rob said, and to take it another level, which I know King Street also does, is there are different ways you can project and realize the value of your experience and your presence in the market. And one is getting involved in supporting the broader community, which is an industry organization or special efforts that the industry is seeing through. So there's a whole wealth of opportunities to engage your staff, your company, to really embed yourself in a very unique and distinct way in the industry. You can elevate it even more when you start establishing relationships, and I think relationships in this business is probably the ultimate form of experience beyond background or technical training. It's knowing Eric Lander of the Broad Institute and how he formulated this notion of creating a permanent endowment and encouraging Eli Broad to put the money forth to do that, or knowing a Henry Tremere who grew Genzyme to where it is, only to have his own staff create 50 more companies all throughout the Massachusetts area. So this kind of networked and viral effect that has on the people we know really gives us keen insight. So what I'm doing is I'm running around asking, hey, what do you think of New York? And I'm getting some really, really interesting insights about how these founders, how these scientists, how these industry leaders think about space in Cambridge versus space in New York, and how they think New York's going to grow. I can't tell any of you that. It's a deep, dark secret. But the way we go about our business isn't just with the industry leaders. It's every single person in our company is matriculating at all levels in every company, and that, I think, is the ultimate form of experience.
What an optimistic way to end. Thank you very
Yes.
much.